How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be diving right into the second example in this series, which is the ParCan example. So we're going to be setting up this fictitious ParCan that has 5 channels. We have a red, green, blue dimmer, and then your shutter channel, which is fairly typical for your basic lights. You have a shutter channel that's got a function between these two values, and then you have your strobe effect, which takes place between these, and then if you have that shutter fully open, you've got another value or another effect, right? So this is a slightly more complicated wildcard I wanted to throw in here just so that we could see the process and go through that. But everything here is static, right? Nothing's rotating, nothing's moving. It's all just kind of color manipulation. So this is a good place to kind of get to for the end of this video. All right, so let's kind of dive right in and get started. If you haven't, by the way, seen the first video in this series, I highly recommend it. We cover a lot of the stuff in the like the UI and UX of the custom fixture editor, which is going to show you how to use this tool, navigation, all that stuff. But yeah, check that out if you haven't already. So one quick note about this tool is if you have the real life light next to you and you actually want to create a profile while you're testing that and while you're seeing it move, you can actually click this gear icon and you can pull up a nice little connections menu here where you can specify an ArtNet or a streaming ACN connection to your pixel controller or your DMX controller rather, and you can actually control your light with the channels down here as you build it out in the viewport. So this is going to let you build out your profile while at the same time controlling your light, so you can actually have reference for what some of these effects do and how it looks. So that's very useful. That's obviously the best way to get a one-to-one match with your real light. But if you don't have that and you're just going off of a DMX channel sheet, obviously you'll just have to approximate. So, all right, so getting started. To do anything geometric in the viewport, we need to select our root object, and then we can create objects on top of that. So by selecting our root object first, we can now create a geometry object. And let's zoom out a bit. We have a cube, so let's select that, and let's choose from our geometry function an OBJ file. And we'll just go ahead and load our meshes. So if you're using the example geometry stuff that comes with GeoPix, you can navigate to geopix/gp/library/fixtures/meshes. And then inside here you have generic ParCan and generic ParCan body. So let's go ahead and load that. We'll just go ahead and rename this to body. Let's select that and let's duplicate it 2 more times. And we'll select body, we'll name this bracket, and we'll go ahead and load our bracket from disk, and we'll grab our third object and we'll call this lens, and we'll go ahead and load that from disk as well. So we've got our 3 pieces of geometry, and by the way, you can model this geometry for yourself if you want. You can use whatever you want. You can use primitives, but what I did was I basically went into Blender and I just modeled a very simple ParCan that had a bracket here, a body, and a lens, all of them separate pieces. And so I exported each of these as an OBJ file with the origin, just in the middle of this body. So that's pretty important for moving lights because when you start rotating and translating things, the origin is quite important. But for a static object, it doesn't really matter where the origin is, but it's just good practice regardless. This is also kind of a place where I can establish the scale. So if I have a scale character, which is just the OBJ from GeoPix, I bring that in, I can model my light and just make sure that it's roughly within the same scale size. One quick note about exporting geometry from Blender is when you do export OBJs, make sure that your scale is set to 100. This will be the settings you want to use. Make sure you turn selection on only, and then you can give that a good export. So, all right, diving back into GeoPix, we have our 3 geometries in, and we want to maybe just tune the way they look a little bit, make them look a tad more realistic. So let's grab our body object. We'll scroll down here to diffuse color, and let's just make this darker, and let's go ahead and turn roughness up. That's looking pretty good. Okay. Let's grab the bracket. Let's just make this like a metallic color. So I'll set metal to 1. Roughness to, I don't know, 0.3. That's looking good. And then with the lens, let's go ahead and set this to complete black, and then we'll set the roughness to 0. So we get a nice HDR image reflection here that just kind of gives us a nice simulated reflection. So that's looking good. All right, so the last thing we need to make here is the actual emitter. So we've created the geometry that represents the light itself, and we can even, rig the color of this lens to light up when our DMX channels do. But we obviously need to see the beams and the volumetrics in the actual scene, because that's part of the visualization. So to make sure that this custom fixture actually creates volumetrics and stuff like that, we need to make one more object. So we'll select our root object and we'll click on create emitter. So this creates the emitter, and we don't really have to rename it because it's just one single emitter. But let's go ahead and make sure it's placed and configured correctly, because everything that we have here is our default base look, right? Any kind of DMX adjustment that we make on top of that is a modification of the base look. So we don't currently see any light coming out of this fixture, and that's because by default the emitter starts with its default values, which is 0. So let's go ahead and choose a color, and this is just temporary, by the way. So we'll just set a color. You'll notice that if you zoom out, you got this weird fuzzy red circle, and that's because the light function is set to point light. What we want for this, and what you probably want for most custom fixtures, is a cone light, which is going to direct the light in a specific direction. And let's just go ahead and turn up beam power temporarily. And that's looking pretty good. All right, so I'm going to also just scoot this back on Z by like 10. And that just puts the emitter's origin slightly further towards the back of the light, and this just gives us a slightly wider angle of light towards the front. It's just a bit of a hack, really, to make it look like it's filling up more of that lens area. So, okay, last thing we probably want to do is increase the throw of this, not the throw, the attenuation and the distance of this light. So let's go ahead and take this attenuation far to 800 maybe. And that's looking a little bit more realistic. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's go ahead and reset our emitter to 0, but let's leave beam power at roughly 4. All right, so this is a good point to go ahead and save. So we'll go ahead and save this as test.json, but feel free to use whatever name you would like. And from here, we can actually start creating our channels and rigging everything up. So the next thing we want to do is deselect everything by clicking in our outliner. And once you've done that, you'll notice that you have an option up here for creating a channel object. So going back to our quick mock-up here, we have 5 channels. So we want to create 5 channels here in the fixture editor. So just create 5 of these real quick. And by default, when you create them like this, the indexes are all properly set up for you. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but these are very important. Make sure that you don't have gaps in your indexes, and make sure that you have these starting at 1, and that's all going to keep things correct and mapped and working the way it should in GeoPix later when you import this into your project. So you can select these little channel objects by clicking on the label at the bottom. So let's select the first, and let's rename this to R. Let's grab the second one. We'll set this to G. Grab the second one and set this to B. And we're not using these exact names because these are more descriptions. What we want to do is we want to use the names here that we're going to be using in our projectors in GeoPix. RGB is a kind of a special set of channels, GeoPix channels that is, and kind of already exists in GeoPix as the default values for many things. So if you are trying to do basic RGB content mapping from a projector, it's usually a good idea to stick with the default nomenclature there, but if you want, you're welcome to use uppercase RGB. You can spell it out, but just know you're gonna have to change it in more places when you do that. But there's also a potential for different sets of RGB, so if you want to have all of your DMX lights separated from your pixel lights, you can use a different set of channels. You can also use masks, but that's obviously a preference, and that's up to you. You can do whatever you want. but we're going to just be using the standard so that things are as unified as possible down the line. So, okay, we've got dimmer next, so let's go ahead and name this to dimmer. Things that are not RGB, the names don't matter nearly as much because there's nothing else that really uses them right out of the box. So we'll just name this whatever we want, but dimmer and shutter seems appropriate since that's what they do. Okay, so at this point, you know, even without the geometry and the emitter, we could just create these channels, save our custom fixture, export that, and bring it into GeoPix, and we could technically use our custom fixture. It's complete, and it will function just like that, but you're not going to see anything in the viewport, right? So if you're patching light on site really quickly and you just don't care what it looks like, you're doing all your programming on the live rig, that might be just fine. But if you're actually trying to visualize things and you want to see it in your viewport, obviously you're going to want to connect these sliders and these channels to actual attributes of our geometry and our emitters and our transforms that we have some. And so that's what we're going to do next. All right, so let's go ahead and grab our red channel, and we're going to make a new object called a mapper object. And by clicking up here, it attaches that new mapper object to our channel. So we have that here. We can select it, and we can also select our channel. We can also deselect everything, and when you deselect everything, it's going to make your little window here kind of hide itself. So just to bring that back, click on channel 1 and then the map object. Okay. So there's a few things we need to rig the red channel to, but for starters, we can just go ahead and rig it to the lens. Let's just make the lens light up. So we'll call this map up here. Naming is super important with this because you'll have a lot of maps by the end of the day. So we'll call this M underscore, let's see, we'll call this emit R underscore, and then we'll do lens. Okay, so we've named it. We have this button called Setup Wizard, and this will take us through the process of setting this up automatically. But you know, once you get familiar with this system, you might find yourself typing it in manually here if it's faster for you. But the Setup Wizard is the recommended way to go. So with our mapper still selected, click the Setup Wizard, and this takes us right into the first step. So step 1 says choose your target object. So what this means is what do you want that channel to affect, right? And you're just picking an object that you've created. You can pick the root object, which is usually not recommended. It's always good to have one layer of abstraction before that. So if you have some situation where you're moving or rotating, you would want to make one more transform underneath the root, but we're not doing any kind of rotational stuff, so it's not going to affect us. For us, what we want right now is to just affect the lens. So let's go ahead and select lens, and we'll click next. Step 2 says choose the parameter type. So geometry and transforms are two very common categories, but you have a total of 3 categories. The third category is emitters, but we don't have an emitter. We're not driving an emitter, so we're not seeing those options here, but we'll see that later here in a bit. What we actually want to do is affect the way that geometry looks by changing the emission color of the material. And this is geometry attribute, so we'll go ahead and click geometry, click next, and here you see a bunch of familiar looking parameters. We could tweak these in the actual editor as well, but we're going to go ahead and pick emit R. Click next, and next we have the active range. So active range is worth explaining. Going back to our DMX channel list here, you know, we have this middle column that you see very frequently on DMX manuals, right? This is your active range, essentially. Most channels will have a single range, but then some will have multiple ranges, multiple active ranges within a single channel's control. So for example, we're not setting this up yet, but when we do shut up the shutter, we're going to have, you know, 0 to 9, which is going to be shutter closed, 0 or 10 to 245, which will be the strobe effect from min to max. And then from 246 to 255, we have shutter open. So in this situation, we will have 3 mapper objects, right? And each of them does something slightly different. But for right now, all we're doing is controlling the red channel. And so 0 to 255 is pretty much fine as is. So we can just leave this at the defaults. And output range, so we are controlling the brightness level of a material attribute, right? So this is just something that you have to know about kind of texture manipulation and kind of lighting programming is generally in computer graphics. Things are in 0 to 1, so this default range is really tuned for doing colors, and so this is probably fine for you if you just use that as defaults. Click next, and then under animation mode you can set this to constant or continuous, and continuous is something that we'll cover later. It's more related to, you know, gobo rotation. You know, some gobos have a rotation parameter that when you set it to a certain value, it just continuously rotates, and that's what that would be for. But we actually we want constant for this, and for most things we'll probably just use constant. All right, so step 7, and this is the final mode, is blend mode. So the way mapping objects apply things is they kind of operate in a stack, right? And you could think of this like a Photoshop layer stack, right? Your bottom layer, which is kind of the first layer, is going to basically apply its color to an empty canvas. And so maybe that first layer is set to normal, which in, you know, GeoPix speak would be set. Set is like a normal blend mode. Maybe the next layer is going to be an add or a multiply, and that's going to be set up to simulate certain effects like the dimmer channel or something like that, and those mapper objects would come later, and in the Photoshop analogy they would be higher in that layer stack, right? That means they would be applied further on downstream. But regardless, for right now we don't even have a mapper. This is the first one, so set is fine. We can just set that color, right, to what we want it to be. So click finish, and you know, that's done. So we've basically gone through the wizard, and it's configured all of these parameters for us by going through it step by step. And so if we take our red channel up, you'll see that our lens now lights up red. Very cool. So that's pretty much all we need to do to rig that up. Next, we need to really just go ahead and go through the green and the blue channels and do the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this name, go to our G, and we'll just make a new mapper object, and I'll just kind of rename this similar naming convention, emit our lens, and we'll just go through this setup wizard one more time, or a second time rather. We're going through it quite a bit, and we'll just step through this a little bit faster. So we'll grab lens, next, geometry, next, we'll go ahead and go to diffuse G, next, 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 and set. So once we've done that, we now have basically 2 channels. I've actually screwed this up. As you can see here, I'm affecting the diffuse color, not the emission color, and that's just a typo on my part. So if you go over here to the let's see here, parameters, diffuse G, this should be emit G. There we go. Okay, so that's working like it should. So we have red, we have green, now we need to do the blue. So make another mapper object. Let's go ahead and steal this one's name. And let's go ahead and call this emit B underscore lens. Setup wizard. I'll go lens, next, geometry, next. We'll grab the emit B, and the active min output is good, constant is good, set is good, and so now we have the blue channel rigged as well. So you can already see that we have color mixing abilities, and this is looking great. So moving right along, let's go ahead and get our dimmer set up. So up until this point, we have basically just set the color, right? From the default of black, we're just setting it to a certain color, and we're letting that do what it's got to do. With the dimmer is actually interacting with these colors, right? So if I have the blue channel at 255 and the dimmer at 127, the output of the light should be half the brightness, half the maximum possible brightness. And so you can imagine this as a multiply, right? If you have a normalized value between 0 and 1, say 0.5, and you multiply that against 255, you're going to get half, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to use some simple math principles to just limit that in the way it works with the real life light. So we'll go ahead and leave the red channel up, and we'll grab our dimmer channel, and let's make a new map object, and we'll call this Let's see. Dim lens. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the setup wizard to show you another feature that we can do here. So let's go ahead and grab our lens. Next. Geometry. Next. Emit RGB. And I'm holding control. Lets you select multiple at a time. And then we go on to active min, active max. We'll just go ahead and click next, next. Those are good for defaults. And one more time. Once we get to the final step here, step 7, we actually want to set the blend mode to multiply. This is really important. For this, we actually want to multiply against the colors we had already. So we'll click finish. And this is good. The one thing that we need to set that isn't in the wizard is the priority. So priority is where in that Photoshop layer stack is this mapping operation happening. And since we want the multiply to happen after we set the colors, we need to set this to a higher number, right? Which basically makes it a lower priority. Okay, so with that done, we now have, basically we have our dimmer functional. So we can go here to blue, and if we set this to, roughly half, our light output will only ever be half. So same with green and same with red. So this is all working just fine. Okay. So this is a good place to save our file if we haven't yet. I'm just going to go ahead and save over test.json. And great, that's looking good. So the next thing we want to do is get this whole thing working with the emitter, right? We have this emitter hanging out, but we actually haven't done anything with it since we started mapping our channels. And while it's nice to see the lens light up, what we actually really want is to see that beam light up in our scene, right? That's what allows us to do our nice previs and kind of show things off in a more visual way. So we'll go ahead and turn our red channel up and our dimmer channel up. And that's a good place to be for the time being. So we'll go back to our red channel. We have a mapper here. And since this is almost what we want, I'm just going to duplicate this. I'm going to duplicate that mapper, and we'll just rename this to emit R beam. So that's looking good. It is currently priority 1. Let's go ahead and set it to, priority 1's fine. We're affecting something different, so it's not too important. We need to make a few changes here to the type, so let's go ahead and change this to emitters, because what we want to do is we want to affect an emitter attribute, right? The emitter here has emitter attributes, and so the things that fall in this section, this stuff is an emitter attribute. So to affect those, we need to make sure that our mapper is set to the correct type. So with that done, we can update our targets, right? Our target is no longer a lens, right? This is the name of the object. Lens is what we were trying to do before. Now our target should be emitter. And the emit R parameter is actually the same name, so we can actually leave that the same. That should be fine. And so you'll notice here, as soon as we've typed those values in, we now have our emitter is actually moving with the lens color, and it's doing the exact same thing. You'll notice that the dimmer, though, isn't actually affecting the beam. And that's because we didn't actually configure our dimmer to affect that. It's only affecting the emission parameters for our geometry. So we'll come back to dimmer here in a bit. Well, let's go ahead and set up our green and our blue channels for our beam. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this name. We'll go to channel 2. We'll select our mapper. We'll duplicate it. We'll rename it to emit G underscore beam. We'll change the target to beam, to emitter. And we'll change the type to emitters. So now we should have our green channel working, which we do. Next is our blue channel. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and duplicate this mapping object in our blue channel, and we'll rename it the same as we've been doing for the others. M underscore emit B underscore beam. We'll set the type to emitters, and we'll set the target to emitter. And emit B is what we want, and things are looking good. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. It's becoming quite functional. So next what we want to do is get our dimmer to affect our beam. So as you can imagine, the process is very similar. So we're going to duplicate this mapping object that we have in the dimmer slot, and we'll rename this to dim beam. And before we kind of start changing things, you'll notice here that targets and parameters looks a little bit different. We actually have 3 copies of the same object, and we have emit R, emit G, and emit B, and they're all space separated. And this is because when we went through the wizard, we selected multiple parameters to affect at once, right? This could have been done with separate mapping objects, but what we want is to simplify it, and so we basically selected all 3 at once. And so for whatever things you have here, you also need to have those up here. So you have to have it multiple times. So we're going to just stick with this format, and we're going to change the type to emitter. Priority 2 is important. We're going to leave that the same. For targets, we will do emitter, emitter, emitter. Just type it in 3 times. And here, let me pull this out a little bit so you can see the whole string. And then for parameters, emit RGB is fine because it is the same name between geometry and emitters for that particular parameter. So everything else looks good, should be good. And if we turn this down, you'll see that our dimmer works exactly as it should. So this is looking great. So let's go ahead and save this where it's at. We'll save this as test.json once again. And now we're going to get into slightly deeper waters, and we're going to set up this shutter channel to do what we needed to do. So this is, basically, let's go have a quick recap of how this is supposed to work. We've got our, channels 0 through 9, which is going to be shutter closed, which means if our slider is somewhere in this range, we're not going to see anything coming out of our light. So that's pretty self-explanatory. We have the strobe effect slow to fast, which happens between 10 and 245. And then we have shutter open, which is going to be from 246 to 255, which, we can think of this as, using our dimmer as an example here. Shutter closed would be multiplying by 0. Shutter open would be multiplying by 1, or just not doing anything at all. And then strobe effect slow to fast is a special one, and we'll just talk about that when we get to it. So let's go ahead and set up the shutter closed first. So 0 to 9. So 0 to 9. That's the range that we want to do here. So let's go ahead and click on our shutter channel, and let's make a mapper, and we'll call this shutter closed. So we'll call this shutter closed. And for this, let's go ahead and go through our setup wizard. So we'll click on this, and we're just going to work with our beam for now, our emitter object. And so we'll click on our emitter, and we'll go to emitters type. And then, the things that we want to affect, we could do this a couple different ways. We could multiply against our emit RGB, and we could just kind of control things in that realm. We could also affect the brightness multiplier if we wanted to. But I think what we want to do, just to kind of keep this consistent, is we'll just stick with manipulating emit RGB. So let's go ahead and select all 3 of these with the control button on our keyboard pressed down. Let's click next. And here we actually want something different, right? So going back to our DMX channels list, 0 to 009. So what we want here for active max is not 255, but 9. So once we've got that set, you can see that it matches exactly. We'll just click next. And for output min and output max, what we're dealing with here is we're just basically wanting to always multiply it by 0 when it's within this range. The problem with what you see here in GeoPix is what we've basically told it from the last step to now is that from 0 to 9, we want to use the values from 0 to 1. But we don't want a range, we just want a constant value. And so the way that you can use this system to kind of achieve that is just by setting both of these to the same value. So 0, 0 means we're not going to have any range. It's just going to be the flat value of 0 between those two ranges. So that's what we want. So we'll click next. Constant is correct. Blend mode, we actually want to set this to multiply, very important. And then we'll click finish. And we want to set the priority to something higher, like 3. So this is going to be the third operation in the layer stack. Okay. So you'll notice that once we go above 9, let's make this a little taller. 9 is closed, but as soon as we hit 10, our lens is open. But from 0 to 9, we get the desired result, which is the shutter is closed. So that's good. That's working as we'd expect. We are going to duplicate this for the lens. So let's go ahead and select that mapping object and duplicate it. And we'll just call this lens. Let's call this first one that we set up beam. Make sure we know which one's which. And then here we just need to change a few simple things. We'll change this from emitter type to geometry type. We'll change the targets from emitter, emitter, emitter to lens, lens, lens. And there we go. Now when we have it up from 10 and above, we've got action, and down here it's off. So that's exactly what we want. So great. The next thing we want to do is set up the strobe section, which is kind of that big middle section that happens from roughly here to here. And so to set this up, we're going to use the wizard again. So let's go ahead and select our shutter channel, and we will create a new mapping object. And let's go ahead and copy the name of this one. And we'll call this shutter closed. No, we don't want to do that. Let's do strobe. We'll just call it strobe beam. So again, this mapping object is representing this middle row right here. So I'm just using strobe. It's a nice short name. So with that selected, let's go ahead and go into our setup wizard. So from here, let's select our emitter. So we're going to just strobe our emitter first. We'll deal with the lens second. Click next. Emitters for the type. Next. And then we'll go ahead and select emit RGB. Click next. And here, you know, we want to have 10 to 245, just like we have here. 0, 10, 245. So we're going to put that in 10, 245, just like that. And we'll click next. Output min and max. So this won't matter as much if you are using the strobe feature that I'm about to show you. So you can kind of just ignore this for now. So over here under animation mode, we'll leave that as constant. And then over here under blend mode, we will set this from set to duty. So duty is kind of the technical term for a strobe effect. Duty cycle is basically what we're after here. We are after, you know, over a certain span of time, we want the value to be on, and then a certain span of time, the value to be off. And that's kind of the concept behind a strobe, right? Is over the course of a second or half a second or a quarter second, you have some amount of that time where the light's on and some where it's off. So we'll choose duty cycle here, and the parameters here are a little confusing, but it's honestly easier to just create them with the defaults and tweak them once you can play with the slider. And there's a description here that you can read if you're curious, but we'll just kind of leave this with the default values of 1 and 0.15 and 1 and 0.5, or 0.1 and 0.5. So we'll click finish, and there we go. Let's go and set our priority to 3. Make sure it matches our other shutter priorities. And so if we move this to 10, you'll notice that we are strobing our beam. So just ignore the lens for now because we haven't actually attached that. So we have this very slow strobe, and if we move our shutter up, you'll see that it slowly speeds up. So this is a very moderate strobe. It's not too fast. Let's see here. I think it's 245. This would be the high end, right? So this is a good place to go, right? 245. is our high end of the strobe range, and this is what's supposed to be the fastest strobe you can achieve. So again, if you have your real life light next to you and you are running them side by side, you can obviously tweak these numbers until that matches your real life light, but if you're basically just creating something on your own, you're going to have to just kind of improvise and come up with your own values. So, so that said, you can start tweaking these values here. You'll notice that this one, the shorter you make it, the quicker it goes through its range. So the way to think about this essentially is the duty range, right? This is the low end and this is the high end. So when you're at the high end, this is the highest end of your shutter strobe range. 0.1 represents the length of your time window, whereas when you're at the low end, right, when you're at shutter of 10, the duty range of 1 means 1 second, right? 1 second is your window of time, where over here it's 1/10 of a second. So go back to 245, this is, 1/10 of a second, and then what the second value means, 0.5 is telling us that for half of that 1/10 of a second, our strobe is on, and for half, the other half it's off. So if we go back down to 10, right, so now we're operating over the course of a second. So every time it flashes, you see that second starts, and then it starts again, and it starts again. And the duty bias of 0.1 is saying that for 1/10 of that second, the light is on. And then for the other 9/10, it's off. And you'll notice that with DMX lights, it kind of deviates from this sometimes. It's different per manufacturer. But the other reason why this exists is because realistically, you just can't strobe something on a 60 FPS system and actually see what you should be seeing in real life, because you don't have enough time or enough frames to really see that. So these tools, these two variables basically let you fine tune it to where it's maybe not exactly realistic, but it has the same effect on screen that you're kind of going for in real life, or at least as close as you can get. So again, just to recap the duty range, right? This is this column, the first column here is your minimum values. This is to kind of pull this back up. When our DMX channel value is at 10, we are working with these values, and as we move towards, in our case, 245, we are transitioning or fading into these values. So this is the low end, this is the high end. And so yeah, basically the duty range, this is your time window for the duty cycle, and that gets smaller as the strobe effect gets faster, right? Because as it speeds up, you're repeating that more quickly, or it's over a shorter amount of time. And then duty bias is how much of that time window is devoted towards being on versus off. So 0.1 means it's on for 10% of that 1 second, and then over here it's saying it's on for 50% of that 1/10 of a second. So again, it's very technical, very mathy, but once you get going and playing with these values, it'll start to make sense pretty quickly, I promise. So all right, we're going to take this mapping object and duplicate it once more, and we'll call this strobe lens. And we'll go ahead and set this to geometry, and we'll set this to lens. And now, as you can see, we've got our entire system strobing beautifully. So it's important to get these values the same for both, because if you don't, your lens and your actual volume are going to pulse at different cycles. So if you want to make sure that matches, just make sure you do one correctly, and you can just duplicate it and tweak it to affect both. So as we kind of step through these ranges, we just kind of increasingly strobe faster and faster. So 245, that's a pretty aggressive strobe, and that feels like about what you'd see in real life. So great. Okay, so the last thing that we need to program in, or maybe we don't, we'll see here in a moment, is this very last one, the shutter open. Now, if we just take this all the way up, you'll notice that our shutter is open, and it's not because we programmed it to do that. It's just because these active ranges that we see, here where it says 10 to 245. Basically, once that DMX channel goes outside of that range, it's no longer applying this mapping. So by effect, as soon as we leave this range, nothing in this stack is even in that 0 to 255 range, right? Everything is either 0 to 9 or 10 to 245. So as soon as we go to 246 and above, you know, nothing, these two aren't even in effect, which means that by default we have shutter open. So it's actually not necessary to, it's kind of redundant to make a fourth or a fifth and a sixth mapping object for the shutter channel, but you know, you could if you wanted to, or maybe you have a more complex fixture, it might be necessary for another reason. But there you have it. So with this done, we can click save, and we'll just save this over test.json, and we'll go ahead and let's just go ahead and move this window down. And so to kind of get this going in our viewport, it's quite simple. Let's go ahead and create a objects all custom fixture. And this is, of course, the default, but we're going to go ahead and load the one we just made, which is test.json. And so you just give that a brief moment to fully calculate the shaders and stuff in the background. And there you have it. There's our lovely ParCan. So if we go ahead and select this, and we'll create a projector, and we'll scoot that projector back a bit. And we actually don't want two projectors. You know what, we can get by. No, let's go ahead and make two. So yeah, we're going to duplicate this projector, and we're going to take both of these, and we'll just kind of scale them up a little bit. And so we've got one of these projectors, which will be, just for a quick demonstration, our RGB projector. And then one of these will be for dimmer shutter. All right, so to set these up very quickly and briefly, we need to go ahead and kind of remember what channels we're using, right? Now we could just pull this window back up and look, but there's another nifty tool here in GeoPix that got added recently under File Preferences, which is your Show Global Data toggle. This is just a useful debug setting that lets you see some information that's very helpful. So down here we have our channels and our masks. So these are just the names as they exist globally in GeoPix, and so these are very useful because you can just type these in to your projector, for instance. So over here for our dimmer and shutter projector, let's just go ahead and reset these all to empty so there's no routing information. So for the R channel, we'll set this to the dimmer, and the G, we'll set this to the shutter. And so with that done, for now, let's just go ahead and max these out, right? Let's just make sure that the dimmer and the shutter are at 100%, and let's go ahead and hide this projector for now. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is give ourselves some color values. And so with our RGB projector, which is already by default RGB, we can just go ahead and give ourselves a color. And there you go. I'm going to go ahead and hide this projector. It's still active. So you can see that we see our lens, but we don't see any volumetrics. And that is absolutely normal. By default, when you start GeoPix, a new project, for instance, a lot of settings in the lighting's configuration are disabled by default for performance reasons. So if you select lighting over here in the outliner, you want to scroll down until you get the lighting sections. And if you're doing stuff with point lights, aka regular fixtures, you can turn these on as well. In fact, I'll go and turn them on even though we're not using them. And then cone lighting, we want to turn this on as well. So we'll just turn on enable lighting and enable volumetrics. And as soon as we turn those on, you now see the cone. So that's looking good. We select our RGB projector again. We can just go ahead and just leave it for red for now. And if we take this custom fixture, we can now duplicate it and just keep duplicating this out. Make ourselves a little array here. And I'll select these. And we'll go ahead and duplicate these and put them on the other side just to give ourselves a little row of lights. Okay. And with that done, we'll just go ahead and take our RGB projector here, which is currently just using a constant value of red. And let's go over here into the I/O tab. We're almost done with this video. We'll just throw this simple macro onto the projector RGB. We'll click play. And there you go. Those ParCans are now mapped. So this is really cool. And the nice thing about using the RGB channels as they are by default in GeoPix is we can go in here and we can create a regular fixture, right? This is our pixel strips type of thing. And we can make a hull here, for instance, and another hull here. And we'll just move this up. And we'll do a quick generator from selection. And of course we have some address issues because these are all overlapping. So let's go ahead and set our fixture to universe 2. And let's grab our generator and let's just set this to 100. So that's looking cool. I'm going to turn off volumetrics on the points for now. And I'm going to turn off the lighting too, actually. And as you can see, we have cohesive mapping between these two types of fixtures. And this is where GeoPix starts to get really powerful. You can start to, mix and match, interweave different types of elements into, the same ecosystem, and you have a projector that is basically hitting both of those. And so you can make, you can make a wall of ParCans, and you could have video content playing on those. You could also have an LED strip that outlines it. All kinds of really fun stuff. So, and of course, all of this stuff is emitting light as well. It's not just the volumetric cones. So if we set this to a plane and we just scale it up and rotate it a bit, you'll see that we are affecting that geometry as well. So very cool stuff. Anyways, that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. We have covered a lot of ground, and I know this is a tricky topic, but assembling and rigging DMX lights can be quite tricky. It's just a lot to it, and this is actually quite a very simple fixture. But once you get the hang of this, you get to understand that basically you are simply layering operations on top of one another, and they are affecting different parameters of different objects. And once you build out your fixture and you export it and it's good, using it in GeoPix is very simple. You saw we set this up in just a few minutes. Just as simple as, maybe even simpler than using the fixtures, because again, the internals are already done. You just import it and you throw it down and you get to work. So that's it for now. We'll dive into some pan tilt goodness and some more complex lighting fixtures in the next video, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.